Hello and welcome to the Culture Show. Now, this year marks the 350th anniversary of the Royal Society. So to celebrate, we've decided to explore the territory where art and science meet. So this week we're coming from the Science Museum in London, itself originally founded as part of a centre for the arts as well as the sciences, before going it alone in 1909. Now, as we attempt to bring the two together again, who better to turn to for inspiration than Albert Einstein, who once said that people turn to science and the arts alike in order to escape from everyday life with its painful crudity and hopeless dreariness. Well, we'll give it a go.
Tonight, Clemency Burton-Hill talks to the Science Museum's artist-in-residence, Conrad Shawcross. Tom Dyckhoff visits the UK's first materials library to find out about the buildings of tomorrow.
It's 99.8% air.
And Michael Smith explores the curious and macabre skin exhibition at the Wellcome Collection. Ben Lewis uses the science of psychometrics to gauge the future of art. Vanishing nature forces Will Self to pick up his pen. And Mark Kermode talks to mathematician Marcus Du Sautoy about cinema's depiction of the scientist.
But first, I visit the National Gallery's scientific department as they prepare for a new exhibition investigating fakes, mistakes, and the trickery of artists throughout history.
It's said that great art has a special and unique quality that imitations lack. But while it might seem elusive, science can help us to pin it down. The National Gallery's scientific department was founded in 1934. They're now a world leader in the study of the materials and techniques used in painting.
In the past, distinguishing the actual works of the old masters themselves from the inferior productions of their workshops, from copies, even from outright fakes, was largely a matter of educated guesswork. But the scientific procedures that have been developed here have now made it more possible than ever before to discover the truth that lies beneath the surface of the National Gallery's paintings.
They have various tools at their disposal, but the star of the show is the Osiris camera, which uses infrared reflectography to see through to the level of the underdrawings.
It's amazing. It's like being able to undress paintings.
It is very, very exciting, especially when you're looking at a picture for the first time.
This painting was acquired by the gallery in 1924, believed to be an important Renaissance work by Francia. But a routine investigation revealed something rather different.
When I got this image, I realised there was something wrong with it. The way this underdrawing is done is not the way that underdrawing would have been done in the 16th century.
And what's different about it?
The main thing that's wrong with it is that it appears to be drawn in graphite pencil.
People didn't draw with pencils until the beginning of the 18th century, so that then immediately rips this picture out of the National Gallery's Renaissance holdings, doesn't it?
So that
right?
made me extremely worried, yes. We then looked at it very closely under a stereo binocular microscope. So we were looking at the surface of the paint.
Right.
And discovered that there are actually no genuine cracks in the whole picture. Everything on the surface that looks like a crack has been drawn or painted on. So,
so it's sort of sorry, but I just get the feeling that somewhere a forger is sort of chuckling quietly in his grave, thinking, I fooled them for all these years.
A cunning imitation, and not the only painting with a checkered past. There were more age-old mysteries awaiting me in the conservation department.
Well, this is a picture that was acquired as a Holbein by Charles Eastlake, and there was considerable doubt about that attribution very early after it was acquired.
But he was one of the first directors of the National Gallery.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was quite embarrassing to have his authority questioned, I think. But anyway.
These questions are now being conclusively answered by scientific investigation. With this painting, they analysed the wooden panel on which it's painted to determine its age.
Recent work on the picture has established that the tree was probably felled about 20 years after Holbein died. Certainly, felled around the time of his death and seasoned, and the panel itself dates from about 20 years after his death.
So that's fairly categorical. I mean, it's not a fake. It's just simply a case of as it were, mistaken identity.
That's right. It has an underdrawing and an appearance quite consistent with a painter active in Brussels named Michael Coxey, which is what our curators believe it to be now.
I mean, are there one or two outright sort of screaming fakes? Not to put too fine a point on it.
Well, I'm reluctant to use the word screaming, but the picture behind you is an example of a picture that was probably, almost certainly painted with an intent to deceive. This is a picture that we believe now to date from the early 20th century, which seems kind of obvious, but it was... apparently the hat is very close to contemporary women's hat fashion in the early 20th century, and we now know that it contains several pigments that were only extant in the early 20th century. It has a tinted varnish, in other words, a varnish applied with a bit of colour to simulate great age.
What Hogarth called smoking a picture with time.
Yes, this was done at high speed.
As well as the occasional fake, they've also found that several paintings were modified to make them more palatable or more saleable. Woman at a Window is a 16th century painting which had been modified for Victorian tastes to a doe-eyed brunette. Restored to its original Renaissance glory, we see a hard-faced blonde with visible nipples. This was thought to be a Holbein until removing some of the surface paint revealed the original portrait by an unknown German artist, modified to make it look like a Holbein and thus more valuable. And sometimes something completely different lurks under the surface. This painting by the Lenain brothers is on a recycled canvas. Originally, it was a portrait of an unidentified gentleman with a twinkle in his eye. Scientific methods have revealed a lot about the gallery's collection, but there's still much to be said for close examination with the naked eye.
In the summer of 1874, the National Gallery bought two great paintings by Botticelli, or so it was thought, from the collection of the late Alexander Barker. One was Venus and Mars, the other was this picture, an allegory, which at the time was considered to be the more valuable of the two. Indeed, it was regarded as one of the great masterpieces of the world. It's hard to imagine now, because when you look at it even half closely, you can instantly see that this picture could not possibly have been painted by Botticelli himself. Look at the crudeness of the drapery, the badly drawn hands, the glassy-eyed stare. And I think the clinching detail is that rather unconvincing bouquet of roses, which looks, to me, rather more like a bowl of half-melted vanilla and strawberry ice cream.
In the exhibition, the two acquisitions will be shown side by side. This magnifies the failings of an allegory and reveals the true genius of Botticelli.
Now, the Venus and Mars is one of the great masterpieces in the National Gallery's collections. But what is it that makes this a grade A, 10 out of 10, no questions asked, absolutely secure Botticelli? Well, you can't put your finger on any one thing. It's more like a multiple of things. Partly a question of sheer technical prowess. It's just so much more alive. You know, great artist brings everything to life. Whereas in the other picture, everything is slightly inert. Everything is rather gone through the motions, if you like. Look at that Venus's hand, or look at what even more, that hand there. Guess who looked at that? Looking at it now, I've just realised. Michelangelo saw this picture. Michelangelo knew this picture. He must have done, because he's based the figure of Adam, probably the most famous painting in all of Western art. He's based that figure on this figure of Mars, because if you just reverse it, and if you imagine that hand raised up and the figure woken up, it's Adam, it's Michelangelo's Adam. The draftsmanship's even the same, and the hand is even the same. So it's a little eureka moment for me. Which just goes to show you can make all kinds of unexpected discoveries when comparing copies with originals. The National Gallery's exhibition, Close Examination, opens on June the 30th. Now, from science that unlocks the past to the kind that's building the future. Ever heard of thermochromic bricks or aerogel? Neither had we until we sent Tom Dyckhoff to the UK's first ever materials library for a close-up look at some of the substances that are shaping the buildings of tomorrow.
Some of the most iconic buildings and sculptures of the past few decades are more than just straightforward bricks and mortar. Take the Angel of the North, It's made of weathering steel, which rusts red but won't crack. And that shiny skin that covers the Guggenheim in Bilbao is titanium sheathing, a material that's corrosion resistant in the salty Atlantic air.
Sometimes I think we don't give enough credit to the physical materials that make up the cities we all live in. There's often more to them than meets the eye. I'm here at King's College London to meet a man who's made it his mission to open our eyes to the infinite possibilities of the material world.
This is Dr. Mark Miodownik. A decade ago, he set up the UK's very first materials library, a cabinet of curiosities from all over the world. Despite filling only 2 humble rooms, there are over 1,000 materials in here. It's a playpen for the materially minded.
So Mark, why set up the materials library?
I'm a material scientist, and I spend a lot of my time working with equations and numbers, designing new materials and understanding materials. And after a while I realised, I don't actually see the material that I'm working on. So I thought, well, I must have samples of it. And then my colleagues also said that they wanted to contribute samples. And so this place is not really about what's available now, but what might be available in the future. It's like a sort of jumping off point.
So Mark, out of all the thousands of materials here, which is your favourite?
I mean, to say my absolute favourite would be to upset some of the other materials, but here, be amazed and staggered by the lightest material in the world, called aerogel.
What is this stuff inside? It looks like a ghost.
There we are. Now that is an extraordinary material.
What is it? What is it?
It's a glass foam used by NASA to collect space dust. It's 99.8% air, so it's only 0.2% solid, and that 2.2% is glass, silica.
It's incredibly beautiful. It does look ghostly, doesn't it? It looks incredibly...
Yeah, some people call it solid smoke.
Aerogel is made up of an extremely fine foam. The holes are just 10 atoms across. Imagine if it was added to the simple window. Double glazing works by trapping air between 2 glass panes. If you added aerogel to these 2 sheets of glass, you're creating billions of air gaps for the heat to try and get through. It's potentially an incredibly efficient form of insulation.
So that was aerogel. What other treasures have you got?
What about the thermochromic brick? I really should find a better place for this. So it looks like a brick, although it's blue, but it has a very special property, which I'll show you. I need to imitate a sunny day with this blowtorch. There we go. So this is a sunny day.
Oh, wow.
When it gets hot, it changes colour, and you can see as it gets colder again, it's going to go back to being blue.
Right.
And it could be any colour. We chose blue, but it could be pink, yellow. This is what's called a thermochromic pigment.
These bricks incorporate a dye that can change its colour in different temperatures. Imagine what they could do if they were used to make a building. On hot days, the bricks would heat up and turn white to reflect the heat. Just think, you wouldn't need to install any air conditioning, which could help reduce your carbon footprint. It's not just blue sky thinking which can be found here, though. The library also has samples of materials from the real world.
I've got self-cleaning plastic, as seen in the Eden project, actually, on the roof of it. I think this is the one. Imagine this as the roof of a building.
Like a giant piece of bubble wrap.
Yeah. Now, it's a sort of non-stick plastic, just like there's a non-stick coating on your frying pan. And if you add some air, and in a sense you're making a composite material, right, of plastic air. Of course, you don't use manual bicycle pumps on the roofs of these buildings. Now look at this. It's actually a nice blue thing.
Oh God, it almost feels solid.
So as a material, as a composite material, it's actually a very attractive, lightweight solution, and quite inexpensive too.
Not only does ETFE look good on a budget, it can also clean itself. The ETFE is non-stick because it's made up of carbon-fluorine bonds, which have a similar molecular structure to a non-stick frying pan. Not even a gecko can climb up this. As nothing will stick to it, whenever the wind blows or it rains, the roof is cleaned. Genius.
So what's the next?
This stuff is called concrete cloth. Basically, if you add water, you can make emergency shelters in situ, which are extremely strong, extremely sturdy, keep the rain and the wind off people, and you can do it almost instantly. So it actually takes about 24 hours for this to cure.
So you can carry this with you and then just add water, literally. Just
exactly.
Add water.
Yeah, you sprinkle water onto it, and we've yet to see, the kind of things people will do with this material because it's only just come out.
Concrete cloth is a textile impregnated with cement powder and put on a PVC backing. You can mould it into any shape that you like, then just add water and wait for the cloth to set. The final material is strong, tough, a good thermal insulator and waterproof. It could become the perfect material for a fast temporary shelter in an emergency zone. Although it is rather heavy, so don't plan on taking it on a camping trip.
There's so many materials all crammed into these 2 rooms. I mean, do you ever feel like you need to expand?
Yes, well, I think we'd like it to be like a British materials library. Everyone should be able to get access to this facility in the future. It's both serious and fun, and I think that's often where the most interesting stuff happens.
Think how boring our buildings are. All we use is concrete, steel, glass, wood, stone, a bit of brick. But if all architects paid a visit to the materials library, it would blow their mind and turn our cities into truly magical places.
Fascinating stuff. And the materials library should be in new premises in Somerset House by next year. Now, science and its endless quest for answers has driven many a great movie plotline. But just how accurately has science fiction portrayed scientists and their work? Mark Kermode went to the movies with scientist Marcus Du Sautoy to get his expert analysis.
The world of science has always obsessed filmmakers. Some of the earliest surviving films show scientists making fantastical voyages to the moon. And it wasn't long before Hollywood popularised the image of the mad scientist, like the power-crazed Dr. Frankenstein.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
It's a strange paradox that while cinema is a product of science at its finest, filmmakers have never been very kind to the image of the scientist. If you took films at face value, you could be forgiven for thinking that scientists were all insane, or geeks, or evil megalomaniacs. So I decided to ask a real-life scientist and long-suffering film fan what he thought of the portrayal of his profession on screen. This is Marcus Du Sautoy, a mathematician and professor for the public understanding of science at Oxford. We began by watching Fritz Lang's 1927 masterpiece Metropolis, which created the archetype of the mad movie scientist, the evil Rotwang. Do you think that movies have influenced people to be scared of scientists?
When do people meet their first scientist? It's on the screen. It's not in school. It's probably their first scientist they ever see is either in a cartoon or in the movies. So I think it's highly influential in what actually people think of scientists. So it's an incredibly powerful medium. In Metropolis, for example, there's this general image of scientists in their labs away from society, and that's a sort of fear that they're not integrated. He doesn't look dapper. He's in this kind of strange big coat, and he has got the mad hair.
Yes, and the mad eyes.
The mad eyes. Yeah. Oh my God, those mad eyes. You want extremes in films. You want characters with extremes, and of course, this is the extreme end of the scientist spectrum. I mean, there are people like that. The majority are not. The majority are fairly well integrated members of society.
Mr. President, I would not rule out the chance to preserve a nucleus of human specimens.
4 decades later, you could find traces of Rotwang in the character of Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, but this time, the mad scientist had the bomb to play with. As far as you're concerned, what does Strangelove represent?
I think Strangelove is the fear of the nuclear age. And I think that what is interesting for me about science in the movies is that you see trends happening about the fears that people have in society about particular sorts of science. The really negative side of this portrayal, of course, is that scientists, they don't really care about society. It's a game for them. These people are just other things in the lab. And I think this is why this kind of image of scientists is incredibly damaging. And it's not true. You know, scientists do care about society, and the scientists that developed the bomb had huge issues about the power that they were wielding and what they should do with it. And this portrays the scientists as not really caring, that it's just some sort of little game.
In our modern age, movies still treat science as a threat, like the genetically created dinosaurs which run amok in Jurassic Park.
Don't you see the danger, John, inherent in what you're doing here? Genetic power is the most awesome force the planet's ever seen, but you wield it like a kid that's found his dad's gun.
But here, scientists are the voice of reason, as Jeff Goldblum's mathematician accuses the businessman, played by Richard Attenborough, of playing God.
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
Yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
So what's crucial, I think, about that scene is what he's saying to Attenborough is, you're not a scientist, and that's your crime, is that you've bought the science rather than created it.
I think we start to see science separating from big business and government here, and scientists actually being not so much the bad guys. I mean, it's great, actually. Jeff Goldblum, of course, is a mathematician, and here we see actually quite a positive role model of a mathematician, quite rare in the movies. You know, he's the rock star. And I think the other important thing about this movie, which marks it out, is you see some real science. They talk about the science. I think in the other two movies, we don't hear about how atom bombs are made, anything about subatomic particles. We don't hear about how robots are made. But here, we hear about DNA. We get a little lecture about how we could actually recover dinosaurs.
This fossilized tree sap, which we call amber, waited for millions of years with the mosquito inside until Jurassic Park scientists came along. Using sophisticated techniques, they extract the preserved blood from the mosquito and, bingo, dino DNA.
Speaking as somebody who basically bought it in the early Frankenstein movies, in which you put a couple of test tubes together and connect it to the machine that goes buzz and somebody comes back to life, all the stuff that's in Jurassic Park about getting the frozen DNA from the... Is that scientifically based at all?
Interestingly, it is. There's experiments going on at the moment about extracting DNA from the woolly mammoth, which is extinct, but the DNA is very, very intact, and there is a possibility to actually use that DNA to create some of these animals.
The universe is made of numbers. The golden ratio.
The final film we looked at was one of Marcus's favourites, the monochrome thriller Pi, which follows a crazed mathematician trying to unlock the meaning of life through numbers. One of the things that the film does, which is fairly remarkable, is that it dramatises the idea of maths, which is a very, very hard thing to put on screen. Are you impressed by the way it puts numbers up there as something that is gripping and entertaining?
I think people come out of here saying, I would love to know about that kind of thing. I mean, it looks so interesting, so passionate, and, he's really interested in what he can do, the power of it. So, I use this movie quite often for clips because I think it shows, he's always talking about patterns and the search for patterns, and that's what mathematics and science is about.
Where do you see science and the movies going in the next century?
We will constantly see the movies sort of anticipating worries of society with science, and that's a healthy thing. And I think we're starting to see incredibly positive role models of scientists in the movies, and I think that's partly because scientists have stepped up to the mark, being challenged by films like Doctor Strangelove, and saying, okay, we have to speak up for our science, show people why it's really important, can help us save the world, can help us make the world a better place. And maybe it's a shame for the movies because suddenly you haven't got such wonderfully mad characters anymore. They're actually sort of more genuine, but I think that's good for science.
So scientists could be the next generation of movie heroes.
I think that they're already starting to be, and that's I think that we're in an exciting time for being a science geek.
And the BFI in London is staging a 3-part celebration of science in the cinema over the summer. But now, the Wellcome Collection. founded at the end of the 19th century, was devoted to the art and science of healing. Michael Smith, a lifelong fan, went along to investigate the strange life of founder Henry Wellcome and to visit their new exhibition, Skin. But be warned, it's a macabre and rather ghoulish exhibition which some may find upsetting.
When I went to review the Skin exhibition at the Wellcome Collection, a medical foundation in central London, I was expecting something sober, rational, clinical in every sense. What I found was a bizarre and unsettling cabinet of curiosities that seemed to embody dark, primordial fears and desires seething beneath the veneer of scientific inquiry. The really interesting thing about this exhibition for me is the way it's made me reassess any presumptions I had about the relationship of science and some of our deepest, darkest fears and appetites. But be warned, it's quite uncomfortable viewing. I think a lot of these objects sit on the fault lines of some of our biggest taboos. Like an anatomy lesson, this isn't for the squeamish. It takes that unflinching scientific eye and trains it on part of humanity's psychological anatomy that we'd rather not think about. The gory bits concealed beneath the surface. These rooms are full of disease and decay, shrunken heads and flayed figures. Well, this little beauty here, it's a book about gynecology, but it says in the inscription, this curious little book on virginity seemed to me to merit a binding pertinent to the subject. It is bound with a piece of female skin, tanned by myself. Now, the doctor wasn't some sort of Hannibal Lecter figure. Apparently it was a very common practice in the 19th century to do that, and a particularly gruesome example being that murder trials are often bound in the skins of the murderers. There's 300 of these gruesome little things in the Wellcome Collection, and they're actually tattoos on real human skin. They were bought in the 20s in Paris from a French anatomist who worked in prisons and army bases. They're quite extraordinary things to look at, really. They've got this real sort of naive kind of intensity to them. There's the obvious things you'd expect as well, like sort of naked ladies, but there's some really weird stuff as well, like there's a great one here of a little pig on a bike. These tattoos are a good example of the weird balance of art and science in this exhibition. There are contemporary pieces by artists such as George Nuku and rubber skin bags by French artist Olivier Goulet. They sit alongside 17th century anatomy books full of beautiful drawings of cadavers draping their skin like folds of cloth. The medical understanding of skin has always intermingled with the wider cultural issues surrounding it. I think one of the really interesting things about this exhibition is it shows how our sort of attitudes towards our skin are totally connected with the kind of social and cultural attitudes of the day. And it's beautifully illustrated in this sort of late 19th century advert for Pears soap. And it features a little black boy, and he mysteriously becomes white when he washes himself with this product. It just amazes you to think that that was perfectly acceptable at the time, you know, and that was sort of the received wisdom, really, you know. This is what skin looks like that's hundreds of years old. It's probably from about 1200, 1400, and it's a Peruvian child sacrifice. Apparently the children were led up to the mountain and they sort of froze to death in this position, and you can see from the body language how they've died, you know. It's a fascinating insight into the mind of the collector, though, Henry Wellcome. He collected 5 of these. I mean, why do you need 5 Peruvian child sacrifice mummies? Henry Wellcome was an American businessman who made a fortune in the pharmaceuticals industry and founded a brilliant scientific research institute, as well as building an incredible collection of artefacts from around the world. He's one of the most perplexing and complex characters I've ever come across. And the skin exhibits are just a fraction of Wellcome's collection. When he died in 1936, he'd amassed over 1 million objects. The thing that first strikes me when I sort of saw the collection was it's just the vast scale of it, really. It's such a bewildering array of objects,
yes,
you know.
It is such a rich and broad collection. And there's a room full of legs and arms, you know, prosthetic legs and arms. There's things from ancient Greece, bodily parts that people put in wells for healing, hanks of people's hair, tattoos. I mean, the curious breadth of it.
So what are your personal favourites in the collection?
There are some things which are very tender things. I mean, for example, in the room with the prosthetic arms and legs, you get a sense of the person not being there. There's a feeling of the human being almost present, not quite, but almost present. And you can often see little wisps of cloth where it rubbed on their stumps and things like that. So it's very poignant sometimes. When he died, there was so much stuff still unpacked. You know, it was absolutely vast amount of material, and people didn't even know what was in the boxes.
Was there an obsessional element that he was collecting for the sake of collecting, or did it go in much depth?
I think it was obsessional, yes. Yeah. But I can see why he was so anxious to save things, and I'm glad he did, because we've got things here that, you know, they might not exist anywhere else in the world now if he hadn't saved them.
It'd be fair to call his collection a monomaniac obsession. It overwhelmed his marriage and his personal life. After they divorced, his wife founded a minimalist branch of interior decoration. She has my deepest sympathy. Henry Wellcome's contemporaries describe his collection as a haunt of delightful horrors, and looking around the exhibition, I think I have to agree with him, because I've really sort of squirmed uncomfortably, but to be honest, it's been with this kind of voyeuristic fascination, you know, and I think it's that tension between the kind of thrill of the freak show and rational scientific inquiry that really gives this exhibition so much power.
And Skin continues at the Wellcome Collection in London until the 26th of September. Now, art and science have often been rather uneasy bedfellows, a bit like opinion and fact. But what if one could give a clue as to the destiny of the other? Critic Ben Lewis decided to test whether the appliance of science, psychometrics to be precise, could help us predict the future of art.
Contemporary art crystal ball gazing is the new small talk in the art world.
I'm convinced that one era is over and a new one's about to begin. Those gold-plated works of art with added diamonds or diamond dust are on the way out. It's time to wave goodbye to the idea of, I know what, I'll arrange it in a grid and then I'll call it art. All that shininess and all that mass production is now passé. But the question is, what is coming next?
I've got an idea of what it might be, but no one's interested in the views of art critics anymore, so I'm turning to science for help. I've decided to conduct a survey. I don't know much about surveys, but I know someone who does. Ben Page, CEO of Ipsos Mori, pollsters to mega corporations and the leaders of the free world.
Well, thank you for coming to meet me, Ben. I'm surveying the contemporary art world in an attempt to understand where art is going in a way to predict the future. Do you think that is A, a really, really good idea, B, possibly a kind of okay concept, or C, really doomed?
Well, one thing you have to remember is that polls don't predict the future. They really can only tell us what people are thinking now. Pollsters sometimes predict the future, but the poll itself won't. It will just try and tell you what people think might happen, but most of what people think might happen often doesn't.
But that would be enough for me, in a way, to know what people think is going to happen. If you actually go to one-on-one in the art world, you ask people what they think, you never really feel you're getting an honest answer.
Okay.
There's too many vested interests, you know, they're all backing horses.
Right.
One of the things that really appeals to me about doing a sort of poll is that all the answers are anonymous.
And yes, a survey should be a good place for people to say what they honestly think, provided they trust you and know that you aren't going to publish their individual answers to the world.
How many respondents do you think I need to talk to?
It really depends on the size of the universe of people that you're trying to survey, but most surveys you'll see in the newspapers interview 1,000 people, and that might seem a bit strange if you're in a country of at least 60 million souls or so, but actually 1,000 people, as long as they're representative, will produce results that are accurate to about plus or minus 3%. 500, which might take less effort for you, would be accurate to 4%, but your big problem is because you're going to be using a self-selecting methodology, you aren't going to go and grab these people and pester them until they take part, you're going to send them a questionnaire. A lot won't, and the question for you is, are the people who don't take part different from the people who do?
So it's all in the questions?
The questions make a huge difference. Depending on how you ask the question, you can get completely different answers. A lot of the time we're trying to do is avoid having people misinterpreting the question, but just by changing or adding 4 words to a question, you can change the proportion who agree with something from 30% to 60%.
Holy brushstrokes, Batman. I'm terrified. I definitely need some help with my questions. Time for some old school university talk.
I've come to ask you some questions.
Okay.
But I'm quite nervous because you're a professor of questions.
Please don't be nervous.
A questionologist?
You could say that. That's one of the things I'm interested in, how you ask questions, how you get people to respond in surveys. Yep, that's one of my things.
Do you have any experience doing surveys about art?
I've got no experience at all. In fact, I've never really come across questionnaires about art before, but in principle, there's no reason why you can't apply the same sorts of social science to people's understanding and opinions about art as you can to anything else.
Okay, I'll show you what I got.
Okay, yep.
I'm quite embarrassed to show you this, you know, I've got to confide in you. But anyway, the future of painting is A, figurative, B, abstract, C, realist, D, bleak.
Okay, so that's a little bit of a jokey one in there, which some people may like it, but it may not get you the data you want, and you're forcing that kind of choice. You want to give this to a reasonably wide range of people who've got some connection with the art world. I mean, it's reasonable to assume that a lot of people understand those terms, but some people might not. So do you also want to include a lot of these questions just a don't know category? Because again, I think it's quite interesting to know, if you ask a whole group of people about the future of the painting and 20%, 30% say, I just don't know, I think that's quite interesting.
But we don't want to conclude that the art world is full of a load of question dodgers, do we?
Well, is it? I mean, I think an honest I don't know is a very serious answer.
It's much more complex than I thought. I thought I could just swan in and write a few witty questions and, you know, that people would send me loads of answers and think it was really interesting, and that would be that.
You just have to think it through more. I don't think it's incredibly difficult. And after all, what you're doing in terms of the sort of science and the psychometrics of measuring opinions isn't that complicated, isn't really complicated. You could really get more extreme here. But I think in terms of the simple questions you want to ask, I think it needs a bit of tidying up, yeah.
The chances are, you know, that we're going to get thousands of responses from art students at art schools and very few from curators from public institutions. How do I sort of balance that out?
Yeah. Well, that might be quite interesting to actually find out as well. I mean, how different are their attitudes anyway? That's maybe another thing you can do once you've actually got the data.
And would you help me do that? Because I'm only an art critic.
Yeah, sure, of course.
I've successfully enlisted Professor Rob in my unpaid labour force, but it's down to me to get the survey out there.
The culture show survey I'm doing on the future of art.
I've already filled that in online.
The questionnaire was sent out online, but when you're promoting a poll, you can't beat the personal approach. 869 Art World insiders completed the questionnaire, although some skipped a few questions.
We've analysed our data, and we can reveal the key findings of the Culture Show's Future of Art survey. It shows some pretty astonishing opinions in the art world.
54% of our respondents think that $1 billion artwork will be sold by 2050. 69.2% of our respondents think that most living artists whose work sells for over £1 million at auction are hugely overvalued. Out of all the artists we listed, Jeremy Deller was the least well known. 42% of our respondents didn't know who he was.
But if you look at curators and gallery directors, 42% think that Jeremy Deller will be quite or very influential in 10 years' time. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio
by Professor Rob Breener, whose recent engagement with all things art seems to have led to an improvement in facial hair. Dr. Breener, what does our survey tell us about the future of art?
Well, interesting. One of the things it does seem to suggest is that your ideas that we're at the end of an epoch and things are really changing, quite a lot of people actually seem to agree with you. You'll be kind of probably pleased to know. Yes, you'll be pleased to know about that. Yes. So around 54% of all the respondents, and it's important to note we've got over 800 respondents to this, so it's quite a good sample. 54% agreed that we are at this major turning point.
Well, Professor, we asked people where they thought the future capital of art would be. Considering this is a British survey, perhaps it's not surprising that around 20% thought it would be London. But another 20% of people were pretty convinced that the future capital of art would be Beijing.
But actually what's also interesting about the answer is 33% actually thought it would be none of those places, which in itself I think is quite revealing. They're saying, I don't know what the future holds.
Really?
Yeah. I think the key thing is you've done this for the first time. It's raised perhaps more questions than it's answered, but it's essentially sort of set a baseline for really trying to understand people's opinions and people's perceptions of the future of art. It doesn't always give you the neat answers you want, but you, having done this, know a hell of a lot more than you did a little while ago about actually what generally the art world thinks and feels about the future of art.
So we should do the survey again in a year's time and see if things have firmed up a little.
One of the things about doing this kind of research is to kind of keep repeating it to see how perceptions do change, because almost inevitably they do. How much they change, when they change, I think is quite revealing.
Well, thank you very much for joining me in the studio, Rob Breener. There's obviously a limit to how far number crunching will get you with prophecies about art. But even if our statistics are a little contradictory, they do seem to tell us that the great art of tomorrow will not look anything like the art of today. The future is bright, but no one's quite sure what colour it's going to be.
And you can see the results of Ben's survey on www.bbc.co.uk/culture show. Now, the relationship between art and science isn't all about the future. For one artist in particular, it's been the unsuccessful endeavours of the scientists of the past that have given him his greatest inspiration. Earlier this week, Clemency Burton-Hill was here to meet Conrad Shawcross, the Science Museum's current artist in residence, to find out how its methodologies and formulas have been getting his creative juices flowing.
So Conrad, a lot of people might be surprised that a science museum has an artist, because we're so used to thinking of science and art sort of occupying different places. What is the connection?
Art is really observing the natural world beyond our own kind of normal sort of visual or aural spectrum, and it's really trying to envision the abstract, just like science is trying to see around corners and to see the very, very large or the very, very small, the things beyond our sort of our senses. Yeah. And so I think there is a real link in the strive for truth or kind of just looking at things from objective points of view.
And trying to make sense of it all.
Yeah.
Conrad's been coming to the Science Museum for years, seeking inspiration within its galleries. One piece he's particularly drawn to is the Difference engine, designed by Charles Babbage. Though it was never built in his lifetime, this early computer was designed to work out complex calculations and was revolutionary in its time for having no tangible product, which is what makes it so similar to Conrad's own work. These huge kinetic structures are masterpieces of precision and design, but whilst they look functional, their only purpose is to create thought-provoking visual spectacles.
One of the key things about my work is that they really try to adopt the aesthetic of the machine so that they will look like a very rational system. But as you enter into that piece as the viewer, you're forced down much more metaphysical or kind of philosophical avenues in order to define its raison d'etre.
Right now, Conrad's busy working on a new sculpture, a model of a musical chord falling into silence, which is due to be installed in the Oxford Science Park at the beginning of July.
So you're working on a piece at the moment that's inspired by this. It's a harmonograph.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It was a Victorian machine that was actually invented to analyse vibrations in buildings. But actually what quickly became clear is that if you change the length of the pendulum, if you change the frequency at which it swings, because there are two, they would form these specific ratios, and it would be a visual representation of chords. Reassuringly, the things that we find beautiful are the things that are mathematically true. And maybe when you close your eyes and you're listening to a piece of classical music and you're hearing these sequences of things, these are almost sort of their visual representations of the pleasure your brain is getting from them.
As a musician, I'm intrigued by this idea that music is essentially beautiful because of its mathematical structure. Conrad's harmonograph sculpture depicts a chord and the ratios of notes within that chord. But in music, things get a lot more complicated. Harmonics is not just about the frequencies of different notes in sequence, but the frequencies within a single note. We took some of Conrad's models along to the Royal College of Music and, amongst a cacophony of rehearsals, grabbed a few minutes with their head of composition and my old teacher to find out more about harmonics.
Music is made up of individual pitches, but those individual pitches are themselves composed of a huge range of what we call overtones. Although you can't hear it, what's actually in that C is this, and an out-of-tune version of that.
Yeah.
And much more as well.
Yeah.
If we record, let's just record a note here. There we are, there's that note that I play. We can analyse it to see what that is made of.
But our ear can't pick that up because when you played, we didn't pick up all those intermediary.
No, we don't.
Notes.
Our ear is picking it up because what's happening is our ear interprets that as the sound of the piano.
Right.
So all this shows you is what is there. I mean, that's part of the structure of the pitch, simply because the way in which it's produced, with a hammer hitting the string, there is an attack, which presumably is at that point, and then there's the fade away. Is it as literal as that?
Because it simply stops vibrating and it goes.
Yeah, I suppose this is just
stillness.
Whether this could, I mean, if this is time moving from here to here, this could either be 30 seconds or it could be a millisecond. This could be the very last moment of vibration, or the very last moment of audible vibration, and it's taking that and putting it into this three-dimensional object.
And it is stillness as well as silence, so it has a three-dimensional element to it from that point of view.
Yeah, and I've always been fascinated by music and moved by music, but never had any sort of formal training or never been able to play anything very well. So it was really looking at the mathematics behind it and thinking, why are we moved by such particular resonances or frequencies?
Do you think there are frequencies that have more of an emotional effect on people?
This is such an individual thing. I mean, certain people respond in different ways at different times according to different kinds of cultural programming. You know, a composer like Mozart would never have tolerated a chord like that, which is the famous Tristan chord. Equally, Wagner would never have tolerated a chord like that.
I mean, I suppose there is this need to find patterns and to look to seek out patterns in nature or in music.
But at the same time, we have an instinctive need to see that pattern disrupted, because it's in the disruption of pattern, and we've seen in the complexity of harmonics, the many things that are happening in a sound that is in itself very beautiful. There are so many different things happening to that are disrupting the purity of that pattern.
Yeah.
A pattern that is pure is predictable.
Discussing Conrad's work has thrown up more questions about music than answers, but as he explains, that's exactly the point.
These are all very flawed, and I think that's where they become art, and the crucial thing is that I'm intending for them to fail. There is much about art, in order to highlight our shortcomings in terms of our perception of language or its perception of space or sound even, and how it's just really to show up the limits of the perception rather than to highlight truths necessarily.
But Conrad is an artist on a mission to investigate everything about the world around us. He's recently returned from New York, where he's been installing a vast rope machine in the foyer of the old IBM building, which is also concerned with the issues of time passing. And a trip to his studio in Hackney makes you realise that, together with his team, he's only just begun on his quest.
So what are these ones about?
For me, they're like almost like sort of diagrams of an explosion, where these things are in recession or expansion, but they all emanate from this central point. So they're very much like, they're sort of preoccupied by the ideas of the Big Bang and the problems associated, both philosophical and sort of practical, with trying to imagine such a thing.
Yeah.
And so these sculptures put you in the God's eye view of being outside of the universe.
If you were going to try and sum up your art in a sentence for us, could you do that?
Well, it's really very much to do with the way that science and philosophy kind of impact each other, and the way that science affects our sense of reality. And we are living in these constant wake of scientific discovery, always creating these sort of paradigm shifts, if you like, of our sense of who we are and where we are. Like whether that's Magellan's ship proving the world was round, or it was the first radio telescopes that proved the Big Bang Theory. We're living in these sort of changing realities, but all of them, maybe even though they're probably getting towards the truth, we're still so far away from that.
Now, from a land that time forgot to one that's rapidly disappearing. The fastest eroding coastline in all of Britain is at East Riding in Yorkshire, where Will South has based the third section of his book, Walking to Hollywood. He travelled there to explore the links between fading memory and this fading landscape.
I remember watching TV in the early 1970s. It was a gentler age, for me at least, and current affairs, as mediated by the BBC's Nationwide, seemed to consist of whimsical features about skateboarding ducks and water-skiing hounds. But there was one item that stuck in my mind and remained there while much else was swept away by the waters of time. I recall seeing an interview with a man sitting in half a conservatory attached to a house about to tumble off a sea cliff. He was shaking his head and saying, "I can't understand it. I only put those UPVC windows in a year ago, and now look at the place." I remember thinking, even at the time, that he was a very foolish man. For hadn't the presenter just told us that this, the Holderness coast of East Yorkshire, was the most speedily eroding coastline in Europe, losing 6 feet a year to the ceaseless chomping of the North Sea. The loss of the land used to be one of those things that happened, an act of God in an age when God still acted. "Away with me in post to Ravenspur," cries Northumberland in the opening scene of Act 2 of Richard II, referring to a town that in the medieval era was Yorkshire's largest port. However, it's Ravenspur that's been had away, dissolved so completely that by the 1580s there was nothing left, and Shakespeare was name-checking an Atlantis. An area the size of Greater London has been lost since the Roman occupation, but only now do we put ourselves in the frame for this crime, the drowning of villages and the inundation of farmland. A photograph in a newspaper of a house about to fall from the Holderness cliffs reminded me of this ever-diminishing landscape, and I resolved to visit it in a spirit of inquiry. For were not the householders of East Yorkshire our own Micronesians and Seychellois, at the sharp end of global warming, their 99-year leases bisected by a timeline that in geological terms was moving as fast as a speeding bullet.
Today, this is all that remains of that house. The floor of what appears to have been the hallway. The rest of it's down there.
I decided to walk the 35 miles from Flamborough Head, north of Bridlington, to Spurnhead on the Humber estuary. This would be a programmatic walk, which through its enactment alone would replicate the cosmic forgetting of the land. For, were I to walk the entire way within 6 feet of the cliff edge, I would be making a journey that it would be impossible for anyone to replicate. For the path will have washed away, just as the towns of Ringborough, Monkwike or Saint-Limer have long since ground down to silt. So all that would remain of my own transit would be my own fading memory. Why does the Holderness coast erode so quickly? Because it's composed of glacial till, or loess, in a gloopy word, mud. Mud, of course, has its own morphology, and in an era such as our own, when there is naught save can be analysed, there is an entire science of erosion and its prevention, replete with terms such as coastal evolution, rotational slumping, and beach plan shape modelling. However, the facts on the ground were altogether starker. Except for major population centres, the Holderness has been surrendered. I wonder sometimes if our own sense of the time we live in is not enormously circumscribed by our anti-natural lives, lived out in a matrix of the manufactured. All along the Holderness coast there is the evidence of a successful invasion, not by Nazi Germany, but by the sea. And yet we turn our backs on this, while our collective amnesia is shaped by these waters of Leith, the classical river of forgetfulness. The loss of the Holderness coast is of significance only to its natives, for in the lives of the masses of people who know nothing of this erosion, there is only the steady and merciless accretion and accumulation as wave after wave throws up reef upon reef of digitized memories, a virtual archive that, far from persuading us that we are just one epoch among many, convinces us that we are as enduring as the bedrock itself. This, at any rate, is how I felt when I eventually reached my destination at Spurn Head, that wavering tongue of land that has flicked for aeons back and forth across the mouth of the Humber. If our awareness of global warming makes of us gods, malevolent masters of our own fate, then our desire to preserve every minute grain of our lives is the beach plan shape modelling of entire civilizations. After all, if we can remain paddling in a permanent now, then time can never sweep us away.
Will Self in a sea of words. His book, Walking to Hollywood, is published by Bloomsbury in September. Now, next week, I'll be at the Royal Academy's summer exhibition, but finally tonight, to play us out, the pupils of Brookfield Primary School in North London, when asked to draw scientists, made them all look completely mad. So it seems as though, as far as the young are concerned, science still does have a bit of an image problem. Good night.
There's antimony, arsenic, aluminum, selenium, and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and rhenium, and nickel, neodymium, neptunium, germanium, and iron, americium, ruthenium, uranium, europium, zirconium, lutetium, vanadium, and lanthanum, and osmium, and astatine, and radium, and gold, protactinium, and indium, and gallium, and iodine, and thorium, and thulium, and thallium. There's yttrium, ytterbium, actinium, rubidium, and boron, gadolinium, niobium, iridium, and strontium, and silicon, and silver, and samarium, and bismuth, bromine, lithium, beryllium, and barium. There's holmium and helium and hafnium and erbium and phosphorus and francium and fluorine and terbium and manganese and mercury, molybdenum, magnesium, dysprosium and scandium and cerium and cesium and lead, praseodymium and platinum, plutonium, palladium, promethium, potassium, polonium and tantalum, technetium, titanium, tellurium. and cadmium and calcium and chromium and curium. There's sulfur, californium, and fermium, berkelium, and also mendelevium, einsteinium, nobelium, and argon, krypton, neon, radon, xenon, zinc, and rhodium, and chlorine, carbon, cobalt, copper, tungsten, tin, and sodium. These are the only ones of which the news has come to Harvard, and there may be many others, but they haven't been discovered.